This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. School choice is one of the most contentious debates in public education, but it's hardly an American invention. Sarah Butrymowiz of the Hechinger Report recently went abroad to look at how school choice plays out in other countries and whether there might be lessons worth importing back home to the U.S. She joins us today. Sarah, great to have you.
Thanks for having me again.
So you visited 3 countries. You went to New Zealand, Sweden, and also to France. What was the central question you were trying to answer?
So my premise was looking at countries that already have more robust school choice systems than we have in the United States, especially with Betsy DeVos as our Secretary of Education. There's reason to believe that the United States is going to continue its trend towards more and more school choice. But as you mentioned, this is not something specific to America. This is something that other countries have been doing in a much larger scale for decades even. So I wanted to see what we could learn from these more large-scale school choice programs that have been around for long enough to get some of the kinks worked out and see what worked, what didn't work, what was still complicated, what questions were still unanswered, to get an idea of where we might be a decade from now.
You started in New Zealand, and you call it a school choice utopia. But it's interesting because it hasn't quite played out the way that proponents thought it would in terms of driving competition or even steering parents in a particular direction when they do make that kind of choice for their school. Let's dig a little bit into that. If I'm a parent in New Zealand, how do I figure out where my child can go to school?
I went to New Zealand because it basically has the system in theory that Betsy DeVos or other school choice advocates might want, where students are not assigned to school based on where they live. So by enrolling in school, you're making a choice. Even if you're going to your neighborhood school, there's still, an active choice being made there. And the parents I talked to took that very seriously. They would go and look at a few different schools, or they knew that they had a choice. You have a few different sources of information. The government does try to put out information. They do semi-annual reviews of schools that parents can look at this information online. You can check and see how students are doing on the national standards that they have. But in practice, that's not really how most parents and most families were making their decisions. That would be a consideration. But even when they were talking about academics, they weren't necessarily talking about looking at these official measures of academics, but more the reputation that a school had. Unfortunately, what happened there is something we've seen happen here as well, is the reputation of the school also would be very closely linked with the student demographics. So more low-income schools tended to have a worse reputation, whether or not that was earned. Parents cared about a gut feeling. Schools would have open houses or have parents come visit whenever they wanted to. And so how did they feel when they walked on campus? It really wasn't purely based on the scientific calculation of this school has stronger academic results, therefore it is the best school.
And that carried over as well to some of the staff. I was fascinated that you had an anecdote from one educator who went to work at one of these schools, and people had told her, no, this isn't the school you want to work at. It's not the best school. There are better schools. But when she was there, she heard laughter coming from one of the classrooms, and that persuaded her that that was a place she wanted to work.
Right. She had just moved back to New Zealand. She had been in Australia for a few years and was an educator, was looking for somewhere to work. And there were 3 schools in that town that were possibilities for her. And everyone said, stay away from this school. It was a more low-income school. It has had some struggles in the past, but it's done a relatively good job of raising its student performance. And once she was able to get in there and see the environment and spend some time there, she was brought on board and ended up really loving working there. Now she's the principal.
Is it fair to say, Sarah, that if test scores in New Zealand aren't necessarily stellar, they are stable, and that maybe that this sort of choice process that they have in place has made people at least feel comfortable with it? Is there a big push right now to make any changes?
So to answer the first part of that, New Zealand scores on a whole have been stable or stagnant, depending on how you look at it. I've heard it characterized both ways. It's not as though school choice has completely destroyed the educational system there, which I think is a really important thing to note, that it hasn't led to these market improvements, but it also hasn't led to everything falling apart. But there are changes happening there. Recently, the government announced that they are going to take a closer look at this. This particular choice method has been in place since 1989 in New Zealand. So it's been around for a long time and people want to revisit it. They're revisiting how do they fund their schools. Right now, they have a decile system and lower decile schools get more money, which is a reasonable way to fund schools. But what that means is it helps, kind of contribute to that reputation. It's a shorthand way of saying this school isn't good. They're looking at different ways of managing, having parents have choice, but still trying to have neighborhood schools, which is a really tricky balance to strike. Can you set aside spots for students from a neighborhood? In what cases shouldn't you do that? So they're still having a lot of conversations about this, even though this has been the law of the land for decades.
We're talking with the Hechinger Report's Sarah Butrymowiz about her reporting on school choice abroad. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app and also on Spotify. And if you're using iTunes, please take a moment to rate us. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Sarah, I wanted to point out that you are an EWA Reporting Fellow, which meant you got some financial support and other resources from EWA to help you make this trip overseas. In addition to going to New Zealand, as we mentioned, you also went to Sweden. And Sweden adopted what I guess Americans would consider a universal voucher program back in 1992. And if I'm understanding correctly, it means regardless of where you live, the state assigns per pupil funding to each child, and it follows them wherever they go to school, right?
Yes, that's right. It's almost like a hybrid between vouchers as we understand them in charter schools, because the private schools, which are called free schools there, still do have to follow the national curriculum. They still are inspected by the national government. So in that way, they're more akin to charter schools. But in terms of the funding, it is, again, what Secretary DeVos talks about all the time, this idea of funding following the student. And so that then makes a lot of pressure for free schools and for traditional public schools to really try to market themselves so they can get those students, because that's the only way that they get the money to keep on being open.
We talked about international tests for New Zealand. Let's talk about them for Sweden. Unlike New Zealand, their test scores were relatively high as early as 2000, but they've been on a steady downward trend since then. What are people saying is the relationship between that and this free schools model?
So the interesting thing in Sweden is that it's really hard to tease out exactly what caused this decline. Between 2000 and 2012, I believe, in the PISA test, they had the sharpest decline in test scores out of all participating countries. And that kind of sent them into a little bit of a panic trying to figure out what was happening. But the reason it's hard to tease out the actual reason is that the free schools movement began at the same time a few other major education shifts were put in place. One of those was decentralizing education, so more autonomy was given to individual schools and to local governments. So they are still having many debates about what actually caused this and how do we know what the impact of free schools is on the education system as a whole.
Well, it's funny because when I was reading this piece, what was going through my head is that there's something that's the same in every language, and that's correlation is not causation.
Exactly. And that is something I found in these countries and in all the research I did, is that this is a messy, complex question everywhere, and no one quite has a clear answer of what is the true impact of school choice and what is the most effective or efficient way to do it. And Sweden is kind of the epitome of that inner struggle within a country.
Betsy DeVos is a strong supporter of private schools. Her own children went to private education, and she herself is a product of Christian academies. France has the longest standing tuition voucher program of the 3 countries you visited. It's been the system since 1959. What are the lessons here for the U.S. in terms of what happens when you have this kind of widespread, federally subsidized tuition support to private schools in terms of the quality of education students might actually end up receiving?
So I went to France because I was interested in looking at a more pure voucher system. Like I said, Sweden's a little bit more of a mix of charters and vouchers. And what I learned is that even though heavily subsidizing private schools can really keep the cost down, So that does open up the possibilities for middle income or low income families to go to a private school. That doesn't necessarily close any kind of gaps in the quality of education students are getting. And what I found was that both the public schools I went to and the private schools I went to wished they had more money. So there was a bit of a concern that perhaps the funding was being watered down for both of them. That's not to say that they would have changed the system. It's, again, been in place for so long there. It's just kind of a way of life. But once more, it's not really serving as this equalizer, as some supporters of vouchers hope that vouchers would do.
It's certainly a consideration here in the U.S. when we talk about vouchers. There's that omnipresent reality, which is that whatever the government is going to say, this is our contribution for you to take your child where you want to go, that's probably not going to match the tuition and expenses of a really high-quality private school, presuming they even have open seats and want to accept your child.
Exactly. Again, the theories around how all of this will work get really messy when you start to play them out in real life. And so the way that the subsidizing works in France is actually that private schools, they sign this contract, they agree to follow the national curriculum, use only, nationally approved teachers. There's a few other things that they sign up for. Then the government gives them money directly to pay for teacher salary. The towns that they are in give them money. And so what they are then able to do is kind of calculate a significantly discounted price for their students. But it's not free. It's still more expensive than public education. And like you said, private school is completely within its rights to say, we don't want to sign this national contract. And the tuition for the schools that don't take part in this is extremely high compared to the average tuition for the schools that do take part in it. That just sets up further barriers.
When I finished your series, something that was going through my mind as a big takeaway is that having choice alone doesn't necessarily make families more informed consumers of the education marketplace, and it may not drive real reform. What kind of questions are you hoping people are asking after they read this, whether they're educators or, reform advocates who may be thinking about school choice policies for our country?
That's a great question. I mean, I think your takeaways are two of the ones that I hoped that people would get. And I think that I would like people to be trying to make this leap from the perfect, easy, hypothetical world into how this translates into real life. So thinking more closely about the details, about how does transportation work? How do parents get the information to make their decisions? What information do they even care about? What is the impact on both types of schools, private and public, when this is the way the money flows? I would hope that people would be left with some more specific questions, maybe, than just the big picture stuff, because I think what these countries and others around the world have shown is that there's so many little details that you have to pay attention to.
Sarah Butrymowiz is a senior editor for investigations at the Hechinger Report and also an EWA Reporting Fellow. Sarah, thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And an unsolicited plug for the EWA Fellowship. It's a great experience. I'm very grateful I was able to take a part of it.
Thank you, Sarah. And that wraps up another episode for us. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to support the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, everybody, and thank you for listening.